All right, Bevy Jam 7 is coming up this weekend, and I was thinking about a number of different crates that I'm going to use for the jam. Typically, I let myself get stuck in tech demo territory, but this time I'm actually going to try to, make a game. So here's a couple of the crates that I'm going to use, as well as alternatives if you don't like them, and a couple of the tools that I'm also going to use. Speaking of, the first tool that we're going to talk about is the Bevy CLI. Now, there's the Bevy CLI and the Bevy linter, which are both kind of packaged as part of the Bevy CLI. And I would say this functions as kind of three use cases. The first one is project scaffolding. So if I do Bevy new Bevy Jam 7 video, which is the video we're going to talk about right now, that creates a template from a repo over on GitHub. And if I look into that directory, maybe with tree, we can see that I got a cargo toml and a source main.rs. This is an extremely minimal template by default. So in this case, we get app new default plugins run, but it does come with quite a nice set of configurations in the cargo toml. So obviously you get Bevy 0.18, as well as some really useful clippy lints, profiling stuff, etc. Just some nice stuff to have. Now, that is one use case for the Bevy CLI. You can also lint with Bevy lint, which is not going to show me anything, so I'm not going to run it right now because I don't have full application to run it on. And then there's Bevy run web. Bevy run web is going to be probably one of the most useful commands for the jam, because typically what happens is while the Bevy jam itself allows you to submit using any platform, right here's in the rules, submissions should be runnable on Windows, Mac, and Linux, or you can achieve that by running a web or WASM build, or do all of the above. You will get the most people playing your game if you do a web build. Whether that is WebGL based or WebGPU based doesn't really matter all that much. I think at this point, most people have WebGPU capable browsers. If you want to go for the extra mile and do kind of legacy support, you can target WebGL. But this is the reason that Bevy run with the web subcommand is going to be super useful, because you're going to be able to just run your application. It'll deal with all of the web stuff for you, and you'll be able to run it on web locally and build your game. So after your project builds, whatever it is, you can go to this page, which is localhost 4000. And obviously I don't have anything in my application. There's nothing to render. So this is about all I'll get. But the Bevy CLI is extremely useful in the way that it will let you get up and running with a web build very quickly without having to do any configuration. Now, if you notice, the Bevy CLI is in this organization called the Bevy Flock. This is kind of like a community maintained side organization to the Bevy org. And this is where those templates will come from as well. Templates can come from anywhere, as we'll cover in a second. But Bevy new minimal is the template we just got when we ran Bevy new. And you can see here that we've got source main.rs, and main.rs is exactly what we saw earlier in this video. There is at least one other template that is worth being aware of, especially since the 7th Bevy Jam is going to be hosted on itch, and you're going to want to deploy on itch, and you might not know how to do that. So in the Bevy new 2D repo, which you can grab with Bevy new T2D, or the longer Bevy new my game template 2D, which will by default look in this namespace, the Bevy Flock namespace, for a Bevy new, 2D repo. This template is nice specifically because it has a GitHub workflows directory. Now, not everybody is on GitHub these days. A lot of people are going with alternatives, but I would say even if you're using an alternate platform, you should be able to take a look at these YAML files, go into say the release one, and this will teach you sort of how to set up and deploy to itch and have a bunch of settings and so on. If you are deploying from GitHub and GitHub Actions, it is worth knowing that these CI scripts, when they run, won't cost you anything if your repo is open source, but will cost you something if they are private. You get, depending on what kind of account you have, depending on etc., these will use your minutes. So if you want to avoid that, you're going to want to deploy either manually and build manually locally or whatnot, which can be tough if you're targeting other native platforms like building for Windows from a Mac or etc. But Bevy CLI will have you there. So just like there's a Bevy run web, there's a Bevy build web, and you can do Bevy build release web with bundle, and you'll get everything in a nice little folder. I'll leave that to the Bevy CLI documentation in the repo that I showed earlier, but this can all be handled for you. There is another template as well, and that is in the Bevy Engine org. This is an official template. And if we do Bevy new T, Bevy Engine, Bevy GitHub CI template, I'll call this my CI template. You might notice a couple warnings here because this isn't actually a cargo generate repo. There's no cargo generate toml in here defining how this should behave, which is the CLI tool behind the Bevy CLI. So because this isn't actually a cargo generate kind of enabled repo, you can just use Git. So here I'll go to the code button. I will copy this and do git clone that URL, cd into that directory. And now we have that whole directory just here ready for us to go with the GitHub workflows directory, which has a lot of the same GitHub workflows. If you'll look into this file, you'll also see things like itch target and so on. So again, take a look at those if you're using this template. This can also be used for other projects. For example, I did a Flappy Bird tutorial, and for that I set up a cargo generate template, and Bevy New works with that kind of thing. So you get Bevy CLI, which gives you building and running for web, cloning new projects. The templates give you CI if you're on the GitHub platform. And then you can also use Bevy lint if you want to. So that brings us to our first crate, which is Bevy Inspector eGUI. It can be, in some cases, especially if you're new, hard to figure out where entities are, what components they have, etc. So I'm going to cargo add Bevy Inspector eGUI. I'm going to open the main.rs and drop in just the code from the README. So in this case, that brings in the Bevy prelude as we had before, Bevy Inspector eGUI. This is an inspector built on top of eGUI and Bevy eGUI. And we're going to use a quick configuration, which is the World Inspector plugin, which is really what I use most of the time. But there are more specific configurations that you can set up. And what this is going to do if you set it up like this is give you a look into all of the entities that are in your world, all of the assets, all the resources, all the components that are on them. And one thing that actually always trips me up here is that this is super minimal and actually doesn't end up showing this UI. So if you go into crates, Bevy Inspector eGUI, examples, and in this case, we're looking at the quick examples, and we'll look at the World Inspector example, which matches what we were just doing. And you'll need this line, which will define whether the World Inspector is active or inactive. So back in our web browser, which we ran with Bevy Run Web, you can now see this UI, which you can configure in different ways. I think you can make this bigger with the UI scale. But you can see resources, you can see assets. In this case, there's a number of observers, the window, a couple of PBR meshes. One of these is going to be the cube. See, this is the cube, I believe, which means if I click this X and drag it back and forth, you can see the cube actually moving on screen, up and down, back and forth, rotations, scales, etc. Now, there is no like save out functionality in this inspector. This is purely a runtime inspector. So if I reload the page, everything is back to the way it was. So this isn't like mutating any files or anything. This is purely like a debug inspector. But it can be very useful, especially for checking which components are on an entity. If those entities have names, they will show up here as well. So if this wasn't just, a random mesh on a cube without a name and it was named PB or it was named player or something like that, that would show up here. Same thing for like the camera, for example. So anything that's reflectable will be editable in here as well. For example, here's Z, so I can move the camera back and forth. Here's the point light. I can increase the range or decrease the range and make it really small so we can kind of see where the point light actually is in the scene. This intensity is kind of a really, really large number, so changing it probably won't have much of an impact unless I make it a significantly bigger number, but you can do all sorts of things like turn shadows on and off, etc., etc. So that's Bevy Inspector eGUI, incredibly helpful, kind of ends up in every one of my projects. If you scroll down in the README, there's more to it. You can set up your own manual UIs. This is the way that a lot of people kind of set up their quote, like Bevy editors, so to speak. They do a bunch of eGUI docs and panes using something like Bevy Inspector eGUI and other approaches, and you can end up with something that actually looks like it might be, an editor. Next up, we have input libraries. So you can use things in Bevy itself to do input. If we go to the Bevy docs and I search for something like input just pressed, there's some conditions for run conditions. And if you look for button input, you can see that these are on button input as well. So you can use these as system params to functions. And for very simple inputs, this is fine. Once you start getting into swapping controls based on context, supporting multiple kinds of controller, keyboard, mouse input, etc. For similar actions, Bevy enhanced input is where I would look. There is at least one other crate that does this called Leafwing. Leafwing Input Manager has been around a very long time. It was around before Bevy enhanced input, but Bevy enhanced input is for me the one that I use these days. As is common with these, there is always an examples directory. This README happens to link directly to the basic action management example, but you can see that this is just in the examples directories. And if you look through this, you'll see a bunch of other functionality here. So we're not going to cover like all of the crate, but TLDR for Bevy enhanced input is there's this idea of input contexts, and you can react to input that is being produced by a user or a player with observers. So in this case, we have a flycam input context and a number of observers to respond to input. Flycam is a regular component. And in this case, there's an actions macro. This first one that we're looking at is movement. So you can set dead zone, smooth nudge, scale, etc. And this is both applying to WASD as well as the left axial stick on a controller. So if we think about this as one action, right, the movement action, we can go down and take a look at the apply movement system, which says on fire movement, query for transforms, and apply changes to the transforms based on whatever the user is pressing. This is the same thing for all of the others as well. And you can see here flycam is just a regular component. Movement derives input action and the kind of output that it's going to produce. So in this case, we're getting a vec2, which you can, like if you think about WASD, you should be getting a vec2. If you think about an axial stick, you would be getting a vec2, like an XY. And there's a bunch of other examples like using multiple contexts, etc. Very, very useful crate. If you have input needs that are more complicated than checking if a single button was just pressed, I would highly suggest you check out Bevy Enhanced Input. Moving on to audio, I would suggest Bevy Seedling. The state of audio in the Bevy ecosystem at the moment is that there is a Bevy audio internally. So if all you want to do is play maybe a single sound, maybe the internal Bevy audio is fine for you. There are a number of pre-existing audio integration libraries for tools like Kira and Rodeo, but Bevy Seedling is integrations with the new Firewheel engine, which is entirely in Rust. It is sort of the newest and most modern of all of these integrations and was in conjunction with Firewheel built to solve some of the problems with the others. So getting started with Bevy Seedling is going to be a little bit different than other crates, specifically because you need to disable the Bevy audio feature if you're going to use this approach. There is an example toml right here, and as of 0.18, this got a lot simpler, but basically the issue here is you need Bevy audio to be disabled, which means you need to go default features false, and then you need to re-enable whatever you're going to use here. I believe from just a cursory scan here, this is basically everything else. So if you follow the cargo toml here, you should end up with everything that is in Bevy except for Bevy audio, which is exactly what you'll need. You'll add the Seedling plugin, and then there's some examples here for how you would play individual sounds. Now, Bevy Seedling is particularly interesting, not just for playing individual sounds, but the way that you can route audio around different nodes, the effects that you can apply to them, building on top of it with spatial audio, things like that. But that's a little bit out of scope for this video, which is, I think, already getting longer than I thought it was going to be. So I'll leave it at, in this case, they're just playing a looping sample with a low pass filter. And as always, if you go to the examples directory, which if you're not familiar with these projects, that's why I keep mentioning this, the examples directory shows so much more, right? I would say if you have more complicated audio needs than playing a single sound every once in a while, you are probably going to want Bevy Seedling. There is also one example that I would like to point out if I can find it again, and that is the settings menu here. This is legitimately like the idea being put everything into buckets, game audio, background music, sound effects, and let people actually modify how loud each of those things are in your settings. This can be super cool. A lot of people skip this kind of thing for game jams in the interest of getting games out sooner, which is why I appreciate that this example is actually here. That leaves us with level editors, I think, as our last major category before we get into the miscellaneous crates. A bit of a disclaimer here, I made skeins, so we're talking about crates that are going into the game jam project that I am going to build in this video, and thus I am very likely going to use Skeen. Whether it's 2D or 3D, I will probably still use Skeen. This is an integration with Blender. So the idea here being that if you have maybe a cube, maybe I spawn in, I don't know, a UV sphere, move it over here. And on this UV sphere, I want to insert one of these test components, which came from, my Bevy application. Here's a player component. I'll insert that onto this object. It has some fields. These are the fields from the component. And that's it. Then you do file export GLTF, export it, load it in like you would any GLTF file, spawn the scene, and the components come along with it. I think I'll make a different video on more of an in-depth here. Blender is quite a large application. It has a lot of features, and some people are pretty intimidated by that, which is where some of the alternatives come in. So Bevy Trench Broom is one of the alternatives. If you are overwhelmed by Blender for some reason, or have been putting off learning it and still want to put off learning it, Trench Broom is significantly less featureful, and that's what I think people like about it, is the way that I'll frame it. It comes with some specific kinds of restrictions in the way that you build your application, but this is also an option. It's well supported. It's been well supported for a couple of Bevy versions now. If you're looking for 2D level editors, tile-based, you might be looking for something like LDTK or Tiled. Both of these work. There are integrations with crates like Bevy ECS Tile Map called Bevy ECS Tiled and Bevy ECS LDTK, both of which work with 0.18, so you can use either of these 2D programs as well. And then starting to get into like some of the rest of the crates that I will probably use or might use. We'll start off with noiz, N-O-I-Z. N-O-I-Z is Perlin noise, simplex noise, Worley noise, etc., as well as more advanced noise. I think if you are somebody who has fairly straightforward, I just want Perlin noise kind of needs, this can also be very good, but it is definitely most useful if you start to understand how noise is actually built and want to build your own noise for specific purposes. There is a whole entire book here talking about what noise is and how to build it, so I'll leave kind of the rest of the, documentation of that crate to, the documentation. There are some alternatives in this category for noise libraries. There's a comparison in the noise book for crates like noiz, etc., and a little section at the bottom called what to choose if you think that another one might be better for your use case. Bevy Asset Loader is another one. Bevy Asset Loader combined with IS Progress is a really interesting way to ensure that all of your stuff is loaded before transitioning into another state. It is a very specific kind of loading data or loading assets, but I have found it very useful in the past, especially for, say, preloading a bunch of audio files, which as you can see here, you just define a struct, you derive asset collection, define the paths for those assets, and bring them in as audio sources. So then this audio assets is something that you can request as a resource from your systems and play them whether you're using Bevy Seedling or Bevy Cura Audio or anything else. This works for pretty much every asset kind that I can think of that Bevy supports. And if it fits something that you are in need of, it is very, very useful. This is also built on Bevy Common Assets, which is also very interesting if you are trying to load arbitrary data and don't want to write a loader yourself. So if you're trying to load something that is stored as JSON or stored as TOML or stored as a CSV or whatnot, Bevy Common Assets can be a very useful way to get that data in without having to write your own loader. And then before we get to our last section, we're going to go off with particles. Bevy Hanabi is the premier in the ecosystem GPU particle crate. If you are somebody who wants to use GPU-based particle systems, Bevy Hanabi is where I would point you. If, however, GPUs scare you for some reason, there are CPU-based particle systems as well. Bevy Firework is one of them. You can see some of the particles happening here. And Bevy Enoki is another one. Bevy Enoki is particularly interesting because it comes with an editor. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit more interactive and you're okay with CPU side performance, Bevy Enoki could be a great choice. And then finally, a special shout out for Bevy DevTools. You do need to enable the Bevy DevTools feature in your Bevy installation, so in cargo.toml, to be able to use this. This includes debugging tools for picking, a frame time graph or an FPS overlay, debugging states, or logging out when state transitions happen, as well as some other things like screenshot and screen recording, not on Windows, though, only on Mac and Linux. There are also some really exciting additions happening in Bevy DevTools for 0.19, which will show things like the depth buffer and motion vectors, although I don't think that's actually in for 0.18. But it's good to know about. So that's a number of crates for Bevy Jam 7, at least a number of crates that I intend to use. Alternatives if you don't like the ones that I pick, which is totally valid. Different people build different games. We won't find out the topic until, I guess, Saturday for me, Saturday morning, when I will be live streaming. So if you made it through the entire video and want to hang out and find out what the topic is together or the theme is together, then come join me on stream. And otherwise, I will see you soon. Have a great rest of your day.